I'm going to trade places with Scott Buecker. Scott's with AE2S. He's one of the engineers that's been working on the Canyon study. Canyon study is sponsored by the Gallatin River Task Force and is being paid for from our resort tax district. Mace Mangold from WGM Group is also on the call. So if there's questions specific to his part of this, he'll be able to answer those. And with that, I'm going to step out and let Scott take over the presentation.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks to the district for hosting this. This was meant to be an open house, a physical open house at one point, and we've transitioned it to just a few of us here in the office, social distancing and remote presentation, so bear with us. The goal tonight is to talk about how we got from capital cost and operations, maintenance, and replacement costs to talking about actual connection and rate charges for the district if they were to sewer themselves and form a district down in the Canyon area. So I'm going to cover a little bit of recover of what we did on March 5th down at Bucks, just so everybody's got it fresh in their mind of where the cost estimates came from. And then our Brent Bogar is going to take over and show you how we take those capital and OM&R costs and try to translate them into rate and impact fee numbers for Canyon residents. And then we'll finish up. Brent will take us through the 1% resort tax, kind of the mechanics of that vote, the dates, the key information, so that if you do want to vote, and we hope you do, and you're eligible, you know what to do come May 5th. And actually, your work is going to be required the third week of April, really, if you're going to get it in on time. Just want to remind folks, when we do these cost opinions at a feasibility level, which is what this study is, we are really in the initial stages here. So we have wide bands on our capital costs, in particular, OM&R costs as well, since they kind of fall out naturally. We're sitting at maybe a 10% engineering on this project. So when we talk about costs, just keep in mind we're talking minus 25 to plus 35%. But that's the reason we do that, is to protect our clients or the folks that we're working for, as well as ourselves, from marching down a path that may not be affordable in the long term, making sure that budgets are there when the project does potentially come to fruition, so that we don't end up with a train wreck when we're trying to construct these projects. That said, just want to set the table as to what we are looking at so everybody remembers. The Canyon area collection system, a gravity system from essentially Lone Peak High School down to the intersection of 64 and 191, and then a pressurized system just to the south of the intersection to gather that Ramshorn Center area residences and commercial business. That would have to be pumped over to the north side of 64 to either a treatment plant under scenario 1, which would be the Canyon area building its own treatment plant, or to a lift station under scenario 2, where that wastewater from the Canyon area would be collected and pumped up to the Big Sky County Water and Sewer District. And you're going to hear scenario 1, scenario 2 for the rest of the night during Brent's presentation, so I just want to hammer it home. Scenario 1 is the Big Sky Canyon area constructs its own water resource recovery facility. Would be ideally located as close to that 64-191 intersection as possible, so we can gravity as much as possible to that and don't have to pump wastewater. That is easier said than done down there. We need about 2 acres. That we have not cited that. That's not part of the scope of this study, but that is a challenge that everybody needs to keep in mind if you were to march down that path moving forward. And because of its location, it would need to be a relatively nice facility, enclosed, odor control, decent architecture. In addition to that, if we're going to reuse and dispose of wastewater there, we need some storage. So this is another big caveat in the study, is you're going to operate rapid infiltration beds potentially and landscape irrigation down there. That's going to be a system. You're not going to have any surface water discharge or any safety valve on your treated water. So you're going to have to store that at the plant site as much as possible. So we had about 350,000 gallons of storage in the scenario there. That's roughly a day's worth. That's kind of tight. So this is not an easy peasy nice solution necessarily. It's going to be tough. It's going to have lots of bells and whistles and controls to make sure it's fail safe, because there's nowhere else for that treated effluent to go. That said, that cost estimate for that facility at this level is about $16 million if the canyon area was to go along. Scenario 2, as I said, is collect all that wastewater down there to a lift station. We show on the map there in front of the Conoco station. We have talked to that owner, and they would be potentially amenable to locating that facility there, collect everything from the canyon area there, and pump it up Highway 64 to the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility. That would be about a 9,600 foot force main. There's a couple of bores there. It's a tight alignment, so it's a fairly expensive pipeline. That said, if the resort tax is successful on May 5th, the resort tax has committed to paying for the lift station and the force main, as well as a return pipeline from the Water Resource Recovery Facility here at the Big Sky County Water and Sewer District back down to the canyon to reuse that water or dispose of it to groundwater. So I think everybody at this point has it. Sorry, that's an 8-inch force main up and a 12-inch gravity line back down with the treated water. Mess that up. So scenario 1, canyon area. Sometimes we call that the go it alone alternative. Scenario 2, everything collected and brought up here to the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility. Sometimes we call that the co-solution. So those are terms you might hear tonight. Just please do your best to keep it straight when we're talking about the two alternatives. That expansion project at the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility we talked about this morning. We have good, well-developed cost estimates on that. Just want to reiterate here that if the resort tax passes on May 5th, the resort tax is committed to paying up to $27 million or 60% of that total project cost. So anybody who did come to the plant is effectively getting a 60% discount on treatment there for the new treatment facilities. Still need to pay into infrastructure that is there that we're going to keep on using or reusing. So this is what I'm trying to get to, is this roll-up slide here. This is what folks told us on March 5th they really wanted to see, was a side-by-side comparison of the costs for scenario 1, go it alone, canyon area wastewater treatment, versus scenario 2, collect it and pump it up here to Big Sky. Sewer collection systems with gravity system to get the wastewater out of the homes and schools and hotels is the same for each. So that's totally what's in the canyon area, and that's $8.6 million for both scenarios. The pumping and conveyance infrastructure is not applicable to scenario 1 because everything is draining to a wastewater treatment plant constructed down there. The $6.7 million you see in the second column, that is for the lift station and force main up 64. So that's why we call it pumping and conveyance infrastructure. So that's necessary for scenario 2, not needed for scenario 1. Treatment, the $15.6 million you see there is the estimate for a canyon area plant, the go it alone. The $9.9 million you see there is 100 ways to try to skin that cat at this level. But what we did was said at 305,000 gallons per day down the canyon area, the build out down there. What does that translate to in terms of connections up here? And those folks should pay what existing people up here in the existing district pay. So that $9.9 billion is just an equivalency essentially at this point. And that said, Big Sky's impact fees are due for a rehash in the coming year, but we couldn't do that until we got through the resort tax vote, because that resort tax vote is going to dictate what those impact fees are for everyone moving forward. So we had to do an estimate, and that's where that number comes from. The treated water reuse and disposal infrastructure is what we sometimes call pipe. That's the pipelines to take the water from the treatment plants and either dispose of it to groundwater at this point or do some landscape irrigation. There are other methods of reuse and disposal that we definitely would be interested in long term, but those are the basis of these costs now. So the $4.9 million you see there for the canyon area is for that storage reservoir I referred to earlier, a pump station that would pump into a purple pipe network that would move south up the canyon area to disposal and reuse sites that we would have to develop in the canyon area. It's $8.5 million for scenario 2 because it includes that pipeline from the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility to get down to the canyon area, and then the pipeline network down there to get to the specific sites. So it's more for scenario 2. Recharge galleries is similar, so 1.3 million down in the canyon area, 1.8 million for scenario 2, closer in cost, but the take home here is the total roll up. So you have $30.4 million worth of infrastructure needed for the go it alone scenario 1, and $35.5 million for the co-solution scenario 2, pump it up here to the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility. So those are the capital costs into the financial analysis. Below that blue bar there, you see the operations, maintenance, and replacement costs. Again, they are identical for the sewer collection system because the sewer collection system is identical. Those costs are driven primarily by the labor. So you have to have an operator to run that system, as well as the replacement costs. So the replacement costs are for the depreciation. And at this level, we used 2% of total capital. So over 50 years, you would fund full replacement of that infrastructure. Not everybody operates that way, but that's the prudent way to operate a utility. So that's the way we did it. OM&R for pumping and conveyance infrastructure, $0 for scenario 1 because everything's draining to the plant again. No infrastructure required to move it to the plant other than the collection system. Scenario 2, $184,500. That's for the lift station and pipeline to get it up here to the plant. Treatment facilities, I want to spend a little bit more time on that. So $0.8 million or $800,000 annually to operate that canyon area specific system. That is also primarily driven by operations, labor, and the replacement or depreciation costs. The $0.8 million, the thing I want to point out is that's for 305,000 gallons per day average annual capacity. The right-hand column, it's roughly a little more than double for operating the phase 1 upgrade and expansion plant here at the Big Sky County Water and Sewer District. But that's on the back of 7,000 SFEs or connections. So there's a huge economy of scale here that we always see in water and wastewater infrastructure, not just in construction costs, but in the cost to operate and maintain and ultimately replace those facilities. And then the last one, the treated water reuse and disposal infrastructure, is again approximately equal. This slide is just how we got to those OM&R costs for each scenario. So that's that $0.8 million or $800,000 for the canyon area versus the 1.8 for the co-solution scenario too. Again, I'm just trying to stress the economy of scale that we see here. Trying to fund $800,000 on the backs of a few thousand connections versus 1.8 million on the backs of 7,000 or 8,000 connections is quite a difference. One thing I do want to stress is that for those of you that were around when the Dow did the 2008 study, we were significantly different in the flows that we projected. So if you see down there in the third row from the bottom, average daily flow in gallons per day, they were projecting anywhere from 1 million gallons per day to 1.5 million gallons per day. Mace with WGM looked at this differently and said, what are the water rights? We're in a closed basin, so there is no, there's not infinite water rights up here to develop as much as anyone would want. And so that's going to cap things ultimately in the canyon area. And Mace's preliminary calculation was a max of 305,000 gallons per day of wastewater could come from the development that could be facilitated by the water rights that are down there now. So that's a major difference between the 2008 study and the 2020 study. So it's just something good for people to keep in mind as to why the numbers are so different. Rather than take questions now, I think we'll take them all at the end, and I'm just going to transition in. Brent's going to walk us through how we get from those capital and O&R costs into costs for an actual resident of the canyon area.
All right. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Scott. So I'm going to go through some of the financial modeling that we've done, and this is all very preliminary in regards to the numbers. As Scott said earlier, there's a lot of variables that need to go into this as it gets more fine-tuned if a canyon district or is formed, whether that is to do its own wastewater recovery facility or to join Big Sky Water and Sewer. Try to get the. So when we look at utility systems, there's two types of charges that we can look at for covering costs. There's an impact fee or system development charge. Those are charges related to the capital costs of an infrastructure development. And that's what it covers. It's a one-time charge paid up front and for capital. It's not used for ongoing operation maintenance. That is what your user rates are for. Though that's your OM&R costs, and those are paid either monthly or quarterly as your utility bill. Big Sky Water and Sewer charges on a quarterly basis. So as an example. So we're going to go through and look at each of these independently. And again, recognize that these numbers are not going to be perfect. And as we look at these at the very beginning, we're looking at it in a model where it's a completely built out system where all of the connections and utilization is there. So 100% build out of the canyon. Now, first with the impact fees, these are defined by state statute in regards to how they can be calculated. So the fee cannot exceed the cost. So if we're looking at a cost of $35 million, we can't set up the impact fees to collect $40 million. It needs to be proportional to demand, meaning that as we look at the different types of users, the impact fee needs to be calculated for a different rate for a different type of user. We have to make sure that that everyone has the same level of service and that we avoid double charging, meaning that the impact fee is paying for that capital. Then within the user rates, we can't be charging within the user rates to cover that capital expense as well. So when we look at the impact, Scott covered this already in regards to the cost of the system. So this is what we used to calculate what an impact fee was for scenario one, which is the Canyon having their own facility, or Big Sky Water and Sewer, the co-solution in scenario two. So we utilize these numbers to come up with that fee structure. Then when we looked at it, we had to be proportionate to demand. So we looked at that average daily flow. This is, again, is at 100% build out capacity based off of what's been analyzed so far. And then utilizing what that would look like if we push that down at an average residential demand. And this is based off of industry standards out there of 214 gallons per day for a residential unit. And so that calculates out to roughly 1,425 residences. But if it's not a residence, what does that mean? And we have guidelines within the industry where we can look at the different types of facilities, and they have then different flows for these. So we can calculate that out and make it proportional. So a residence doesn't pay the same as a 24 unit apartment building. There is a different impact fee for each type of facility. Now, when we did this, and you'll see as we go forward, we just picked a couple of scenarios or a couple of different types of properties, and there's not necessarily every one of those scenarios in here right now. And that would be one of the things as a district, if a district was formed, they would have to take the time to come up with that calculation and then have some caveats of if a type of property that was not in a table, like this table here, how would they calculate that fee? Again, the other areas, the equal level of service, since this would be a new district, this makes it fairly easy because everyone is going to be very easy to treat at the same level of service. And then the double charging, ensuring that those impact fees or development charges are not used to pay, that your rates are not being used to pay what the development charges have been collected to pay for. So when we look at impact fees, the one thing with an impact fee is that it can be a pay now, which means you pay it up front and you can pay for the whole system through an impact fee. So there's no debt calculated into the capital or to the rates or to the system. Or a pay later, which is where you might take debt, and so that's in your user fee, and so there's not an impact fee. So those are two ways to look at the system. And then a third is what we call the delicate balance of splitting the difference of having an impact fee to help minimize that capital expense so that you don't have as much debt, which then that reduces the rates that the homeowners or property owners have to pay. So as we look at the impact fee, then again, this is at a full build out, and that total cost, we have the capacity of the system, and to pay for that system, then we break that down to a gallon utilization. So we can apply that to the different types of property units that are out there. So in the Canyon, we're looking at, if it was to go it alone, that 30.4 million divided by the capacity of 305,000 gallons per day, that's just under $100 per gallon. In the co-solution, we have the total cost, but if the resort tax was passed, part of the total cost is covered by the resort tax. So we have a net cost there of $23.8 million. We divide that by the capacity of the system, coming up with an impact fee of $78 per gallon. So as we look, we can plug that into this table here, and we can see the different rates. But to make it a little easier to read, we put it together in a scenario of 3 different properties that are on that table. Whereas a residence at 214 gallons per day, if we take that impact, that rate of the canyon of $99.68 times the 214 gallons per day, that's a $21,000 impact fee. With the co-solution, it's a $16,700 impact fee. Then you can see how utilizing the proportional formula of applying this to different types of properties, so like a bar or restaurant with 100 seats, which has a 2,400 gallon per day flow, the impact fee of just under 240,000, or the co-solution of 187,000. And then a 24 unit apartment where they're like 2-bedroom units, not with shared laundry facility in the apartment complex, a flow of 4,363, having an impact fee of around 435,000 or 340,000 in the co-solution. Again, this is at 100% build out of the system immediately, and that's how that's calculated to come up with those impact fees. Then we get into the user rates, and when we work to define what the rates are for a utility system, we looked at the collection and conveyance of the utility, the treatment at the facility, and then any debt service. So you have your collection system, the lift station, if it were to be tied to the Big Sky, your treatment, the plant, whether that's the Canyon having their own system or at Big Sky Water and Sewer, and then debt service. So when we looked at rates, we did the same type of scenario here where with the impact fees, we said 100% of it paid by impact fees. Now we took it and said, if we pay for 100% of the system through debt servicing, what would that be? What would the rates have to be in that scenario? Now, one of the things that we have to think about within the Canyon specifically is, how do we charge that? What do we base that on? In Big Sky, because they're a water and sewer district, they can base their sewer rates off of water flows, because obviously they're very tied together in regards to utilization. But because we do not have that in the Canyon, we had to come up with something, and so we looked at a flat rate of charge for utilization. So when we put that all together, this slide here is we look at those rates when we calculate out what all of the costs are. You're looking at if the system's not built out right away, nearly $1,000 a month in a utility rate, whereas if the fully built out, it gets down to around $170. So it's a wide range of possibilities, and that's one of the things that we wanted to stress when looking at these numbers, is there's a lot of variability in regards to how the system gets built out and how the rates could be calculated.
And Brent, you need to emphasize there that that's with no impact fee, right? That's completely financed?
Yes, this is completely financed, so there's no impact fees in this model. And so that gets us to the next model where we did a balanced approach, where we integrated an impact fee with a user rate. So you get the benefit of reducing your ongoing rates and getting those capital costs recouped right away, so you don't have as much to finance. When you do that, then as a district, you do have to think about that proper balance of how much is going to be paid by impact fees and how much are rates, as well as any type of development agreements that might be utilized for large scale developments in regards to an impact fee. So what we did here was a balanced approach of saying for a residential unit, a $10,000 impact fee. If you recall, when we looked at 100% of it by impact fee, it was the go it alone solution was 21,000, the co-solution was 16,700. So we're basically saying about a half of the go it alone solution impact fee, a $10,000 impact fee for a resident. Then we have what the rates would be. So instead of that being, 200 plus, we're down to 127 in a go it alone or $106 a month with the co-solution. And again, that impact fee being prorated between the different types of property, as we discussed, and then the rates based off of their flow. And so you can, again, see everyone is being treated equally in regards to how the rates are being calculated, how the impact fee is being calculated. It's just a matter of how that flows through for everyone based on their utilization of the system. And then finally, one of the other things we looked at was a phased approach. As I have stressed through most of the presentation, and these numbers were all based on 100% build out right away. Well, that's probably not realistic. And so we looked at some phasing of the system. And what does that mean? Well, one, it reduces the capital costs up front because you're not putting in all of that pipe, doing everything right away. And there's obviously reduced operating costs because you have a smaller system. So that then helps to reduce the impact fees because you don't have as much capital up front, and the monthly fees can come down because you have lower operating costs, lower debt servicing. So what we did is a phased cost with that balanced approach where we have a total cost of the system, instead of that being at 30 million, it's 11 million or 14.7 with the co-solution, but then the impact fee at $10,000 a resident. So we figured out the equivalent of doing 290 residential unit equivalents, whatever mix that might be in regards to development of housing, commercial, multifamily, whatever that would be. We just said 290 equivalent there. And so you can see then our net costs start to really come down, that your monthly capital fee in the canyon, because you don't, without that resort tax contribution, you have $149 in that capital user fee. Whereas with the co-solution and the resort tax contribution assisting with that, it's $1.89 in regards to that capital expense. Then, because it's also phased, as I mentioned, you don't have as much OM&R, and so what those reductions will be in regard, or costs will be, they're not as high as they were up front. They're not completely less because you still have certain things that you have to pay for, whether you have a partial system or full system, like staffing and those types of things. So you've got $115 on the canyon for OM&R and $70 in the co-solution. So as a result, in the canyon, with a phased balanced approach, you could be looking at a $10,000 impact fee and a monthly cost of $265 with the canyon as a separate system, or a $72 monthly fee and that $10,000 impact fee with the co-solution. So that's where everything kind of comes down, and there's a lot of variables in calculating this as to how much each phase might be, what those different costs will be. But this was a way for us to give an example of how the two different systems look from a cost standpoint for the users. As was mentioned throughout the presentation, the resort tax contribution of up to $12 million for the canyon for the conveyance and the lift station up to Big Sky Water and Sewer was does have a significant impact in reducing both any sort of an impact fee as well as any type of debt service. As you can see here, what that really equates to from an impact fee, almost an $8,200 reduction per residence, or $44 a month in regards to the debt service or a monthly fee. Whoops. One click to one too quick there. So just in closing on all of that, when we talk about the system, there is a number of things. The impact fees, those can reduce the monthly charges if impact fees are utilized and calculated appropriately to help to offset that capital expense. Phasing of the project will also help to in regards to what those impact fees and user rates may be. And again, as we've touched on numerous times with the resort tax contribution, if the vote were to pass, that has significant implications in regards to the cost savings or what the cost would be without the resort tax. So I'll talk a little bit now on the resort tax vote. Danny was not able to join us this evening from the resort tax, but we've been working very closely with them over the last couple of months. Well, the Big Sky Water and Sewer District and Resort Area District came together with this concept and developed an interlocal agreement between the two agencies. This is basically the agreement, their contract of how this will work from a funding standpoint, what the sewer district needs to commit to, and what the resort tax is committing to. And if the resort tax were to pass, it's an additional infrastructure resort tax of 1% that was approved by the state legislature last session in Montana to allow for an additional 1% specifically for infrastructure projects. The resort tax is committing $27 million or 60% of the project. It's capped at 27 as a max or 60% of the total project for the wastewater recovery and reuse facility. They also have committed up to 100% or $12 million for the canyon project, the lift station, the force main, and the disposal return pipe down to the canyon, if a canyon district is formed. Now, that canyon district, as you can see, must be formed by December 31st of 2022. They put in a fair amount of time to allow the residents in the canyon to decide and make that decision for themselves and not being tied to the timing of the vote, and give them time to organize as a district. But that is when that would need to be formed for that $12 million to be available for the canyon to tie into Big Sky Water and Sewer. With that, the Big Sky Water and Sewer District is committing 500 SFEs for workforce housing for the community. This was a key part for the resort tax to include, and the Water and Sewer District recognizes the need for workforce housing and was willing to put that commitment in there to make sure that they can assist not just in serving the community from a sewer and water standpoint, but also from a development for workforce housing. The other component was that the Water and Sewer District would not apply to the existing 3% resort tax for funding during the terms of this agreement. So that was a key component as well. so that those dollars are available for the agencies and organizations that receive funding through the 3% dollars resort tax right now. When we discussed this with the resort tax, there was a lot of numbers. This slide has a very busy spreadsheet, but just to know that when numbers were put out, it was worked with a very conservative model in regards to resort tax growth. They've had greater than 13% year-over-year growth in their revenue on the resort tax. We ran that at a 3% resort tax growth rate. With things going on as they are right now in the world, the resort tax still feels that this is a commitment that they can fulfill because it was based on a very conservative forecast model for the resort tax. From an election standpoint, this is a mail-in ballot. The ballots are being mailed to voters on April 17th. It is being recommended that those ballots be put in the mail, back in the mail by April 28th at the latest, to ensure that they get to the Gallatin County Election Office before May 5th, because they have to be in the election office on May 5th, not postmarked by May 5th. So we want to make sure that there's plenty of time for the mail to get there. The ballot has language on it to increase the resort tax by an additional 1% above the current 3%, going in effect July 1st of this year. And again, we talked what that means from the interlocal agreement in regards to what the funding is for. That tax is specific for this project. And so once that project is paid for, the tax goes away, or when the resort tax expires June 1st of 2032. So we basically have 12 years in regards to the existing resort tax time frame. Now, the revenue model showed that it would be paid probably closer to 10 years. So there should not be an issue with the 12-year expiration of the resort tax district. In regards to the resort tax, it is just like the current resort tax, so it is taxing luxuries. There is a link in the presentation. This presentation and information will be available on the website for Water and Sewer District, the resort tax, and the Gallatin River Task Force. With information, you can go to the resort tax website and find what are luxury items. It basically are items that are not necessities of life. And for those of you in the community, you're very familiar with that, because it's the exact same things that the 3% is charged on or not charged on. If the vote fails, the Big Sky Water Resource, Big Sky project will continue because it needs to be done. They will utilize state revolving fund and look for other sources, which would probably come from a revenue bond. And based on preliminary modeling of that, a revenue bond approximately would mean doubling the rates charged by the district sewer. It would mean the Canyon project would not proceed necessarily to tie into the Big Sky Water and Sewer, because that $12 million would not be there. Big Sky then potentially would make a request to the resort tax on the existing 3% to assist with funding to reduce the impact on rates. And Scott and Ron, I might let you guys cover this one because this is more in your wheelhouse.
Yeah. This question has come up a lot in the last 2 or 3 weeks. You can imagine why. Concerned that, well, this changes everything so dramatically that this all no longer applies. That's, in our opinion, that is not true. It certainly changes the immediate landscape around here, since it's essentially eliminated tourism and visitation. The resort tax is going to have a down year for sure. But we don't know how long any of this will last. It could come roaring back in 6 months, could take 2 years. But when we ran the financial models that supported that interlocal agreement, we were generally using 5% annual growth in the resort tax over the next 20 years. It is historically done 13%. So we were extremely conservative on estimating how rapidly that resort tax fund would grow, because there are unforeseen things that will happen in life, such as COVID-19. So growth this year might be negative, but at some point things will come back and be in the positive. The resort tax is also, they recently redid those luxury items to include such things as alcohol that weren't included before. So please don't think that COVID has run the train off the tracks here. It probably has for a year, but not long term. And if anybody attended this morning's session, what we reiterated there strongly is that there's no option where the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility gets delayed significantly. The plant needs to come online for connections that are already committed to up here. If growth comes back at that 5 or 10% clip, that plant needs to be online in 2022 to allow additional connections up here. And I do want to say that if the resort tax fails, that last slide had, well, the Canyon Area project stops. What we mean by that is that the Big Sky County Water and Sewer District would not be obligated to take that $12 million from the resort tax and plan, design, construct, and operate that Canyon Area project. The Canyon Area can get sewered and form a district and even construct the infrastructure to get the wastewater up here if that's what they chose to do. It doesn't stop the Canyon Area residents from doing any of that. It just stops the agreement for the Big Sky County Water and Sewer District to run and own that project. And we also just want to, a lot of folks are moving into the next year or so with a lot of caution on their big, large-scale construction planning. In public works, we sometimes see events like this. Well, we've never seen an event like COVID-19, but economy crashing events and do things like stimulus packages nationally that can make it a good time to construct projects. It can take away what was a red-hot bidding environment in Big Sky and has been for several years, and cool it off to a point where you'll get better bid prices. So at this point, there's no reason to put the halt on these projects, and I just want to make sure that's clear to everyone. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. Just be patient with the number of folks on the line. It may take a while to 38. It may take a while to get some clear space to state your question. And be sure, if you do have a question, you're not muted.
Scott, not sure if you can see, but there was a question submitted in the chat.
Click the chat loop there.
Right.
There you go. Question comes from Turner. The 16-inch gravity main back down to 191 seems perfect to discharge treated wastewater into the Gallatin River. Is it fully off the table to discharge treated wastewater into the Gallatin River? There is no plan or intent for that pipeline to carry on down to the river and construct an outfall in the river. That's a major
huge project, lots of permitting, very expensive. No one is doing that. That pipeline would take a hard right and head south up the canyon. We'd preserve all the pressure we could coming down the hill from the elevation up here to push reuse water throughout the canyon and groundwater disposal with rapid infiltration beds. That's the intent.
Scott,
Yes.
how far off of, well, what would the boundaries of the Canyon District be? North and south, and then how far off of the highway to, I guess, the east or the west? Primarily to the west, but what are those boundaries?
Mace, we give control to Mace. He may have that on a machine, but it's essentially.
Can if he's got it. I give that Mace and flip it.
Mace, are you on the line? Can you do that?
Yeah, I'll give you a verbal. I don't have a map popped up. In generally, we picture the boundary progressing from approximately the Lone Mountain Road, Highway 191 intersection. That's kind of the heart of where central collection would either be conveyed to treat or conveyed to pump up to the district. So from a north-south standpoint, that's the sweet spot. And then ideally progress all the way down the canyon area. We have some optimism of progressing to at least the high school in the near term. From an east-west standpoint, as you leave the valley floor, residential density decreases substantially to where roughly the valley floor would be about the western boundary of the district. And then the highway development along the corridor really represents the eastern boundary.
So would it tie in, say, Ramshorn View?
Ideally, we'd love to collect Ramshorn. It comes down to what's the acceptance to tie in and take on those rates when you've got infrastructure in the ground as a Ramshorn development currently does. Long term, I do see Ramshorn would want to tie in. So
Yeah, that gets into the whole phasing. So we want to be clear here that if you did vote for the resort tax to get at that $12 million, you are not committing to form a district right away. And you're not necessarily, as a voter in Ramshorn, saying I want to join the district right away. This project would potentially have sort of a natural development where we start with the core area, and then as users further south up the canyon want to come on board, they would approach what would be the Canyon Area District Board, or essentially annexation at that point. So there's 1,000 different ways this could develop, and we have to do the analysis based on the full build-out, 305,000 gallon per day capacity, in order to show you total capital costs. But that's not the natural way these projects develop, and so there's going to be some sort of growth towards that end result.
John, this is Ron. One of the questions we've gotten over time is why not just annex this into the current Big Sky County Water and Sewer District? Because all this area in the canyon is disconnected from our district boundary, it gets very complicated to annex that. It would take an entire vote of our constituent base up here, and we don't know what the outcome of that would be. We've got enough issues in front of us. We're not interested in taking on a big annexation such as the canyon and adding to our already large capacity and service area issues. So this has always been presented as the canyon setting up their own district. I've said in other meetings that this would be similar to what Four Corners and Gallatin Gateway have done, where Gallatin Gateway is its own county water and sewer district. They have their own board. They're autonomous from the Four Corners district. They have a service agreement whereby Gateway ships up to 20,000 gallons per day of wastewater to Four Corners. Four Corners takes it and treats it. and then they send them a bill each month for that. So this isn't unlike that, and the easiest way for it to proceed forward is for the canyon to create its own district with its own boundaries.
Is there a group of people currently in place that are willing to start heading that up and putting it together?
There have been people that have been in a lot of meetings talking about the canyon project. Whether there's a group that's been identified as the leadership group yet, I don't know that exists, but there's a lot of interest in getting something going.
I would characterize it as no official group, general interest of where the numbers are landing, and seeing if this 1% vote passes and whether that momentum carries forward.
So hypothetical question then, if the 1% passes and it moves ahead, what would be the likely year or date that this might come online? How far down the road are we looking at?
The fastest that would probably all could evolve is a couple of years. It's going to take planning and design of the lift station and pipeline. Those folks that chose to go sign a petition to form a district, they have a process to go through with the county. So fastest it could possibly, I think, be collecting wastewater and pumping up here to treat it would be about 2 years. And it could drag out. If it drags out beyond the resort tax's sunsetting of the money, somebody's going to need to go ask the resort tax to extend that, or they're going to lose the opportunity to pin down the $12 million.
Sure. Okay.
We got a question from Lee in the chat. In your answer, you stated the eastern boundary would be Route 191. Would properties between 191 and the Gallatin River be included as well? They are included up to approximately River House Grill across from Bucks.
The school at River House would be in the second or third phases of that.
Yeah, but they are, that east side of 191 is included in that 305,000 gallon per day district boundary.
And then they even go as far down as crap in the 305. Mace,
Yeah. All the numbers right now are really stopping the main at roughly the high school. Anything economical to collect would be collected ideally, and low-hanging fruit right now is north end of the valley. There's a stretch of approximately a mile of commercial that's on septic systems that are pretty darn close to the river that would be ideal to collect.
On the question of district creation, the more property ownership you have, the more complicated it gets to set up your district. So if you've got large areas of land, the area near the gravel pit's been identified, the quarry development is kind of a key piece of property in the initial first phase of this, because they've got a lot of potential development that may happen there. Some of it is workforce housing related, and you have very few owners of those properties right now. So for them to elect to put themselves in a county water and sewer district is pretty straightforward. You take a subdivision like Ramshorn, you've got a lot of different ownership interests. That starts to break up potential votes on whether or not that comes in the initial district, and it could complicate that. So the fewer landowners you have, the simpler it is to get started. But once you get started, create a district, there's no doubt in my mind that the district will continue to grow over time as people want central sewer for their systems along the canyon there.
More questions?
Hi, this is
Uh-oh. I think that's it. Ron, for whatever it's worth, I'm on board with this whole thing. So if I need to be an advocate or anything, put my name in the hat. Just somebody's got to reach out to me.
I appreciate that, John.
If you don't have a question, please go ahead and mute your mic so that one person who sounded like they do have a question doesn't have a lot of feedback.
Or throw it up on the chat. That's right.
Yeah, or type it into the chat. We'll give a few more minutes here for those that do have a question.
Hi, this is Mike Scholes. I had a couple questions. One is, anyone calculated what percentage of the residents live in the canyon as opposed to the rest of the district? When you're coming, just looking at your voting populations?
When you say residents, you mean of the
Well,
resort?
the people that are allowed to vote on the resort tax have to be residents, I believe.
Registered voters and registered voters within the resort tax district. Yeah.
Right, and I'm just saying, what percentage of those voting on the 1% live in the canyon?
I don't have an answer for you, Danny might. He's not on the call. That's a good question.
Now, I'm just curious about that, just because, since there's two different side people voting on it and that, how each other need it, but it applies not only to this 1% vote, but the canyon needs to think about if they would not take the opportunity to vote for it now, if they ever wanted the money in the future, whatever, they would be at an extreme disadvantage to get the whole district to vote for something possibly that only serves them. So I think that knowing that the canyon does not need to form a district if this is voted through, my own opinion would be that it'd be short-sighted not to close the door on the opportunity to get this money possibly in the future. Just for people to think about. And my other question is that on impact fees, are the impact fees the same for new construction as they are for existing homes, the $10,000 you were talking about?
Yeah, under that scenario, Mike, whether it would be a sort of a hybrid connection fee just to reduce the monthly rates, or in the extreme case, fund it all with a connection fee, then yes, those would be normalized to a unit of connection, whether it be a single, there's a dozen different acronyms used for that, whether it's single family equivalent or equivalent residential unit or whatever. Those would and should be the same for that unitized connection. You can charge different values based on the flows that entity is going to take up. So that's why we charge more for a 100-seat restaurant than we would for a residence, but they need to be the same for that unit of capacity.
No, I've always thought that possibly to do that, why would you not take into consideration that existing people in the canyon have already made a capital investment in the sewage system they have, and whereas a new project down the road does not have that investment, and it seems that it's putting, capital wise over total investment for what you have in the sewer system for your house, you will have invested the first time if you're existing, and you would not have that expense in the future. So just the thought that maybe the future could be weighted heavier to help out those that have already made the investment in their present sewer system.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
It's a great point, and an example of one of dozens of wrinkles that are in this that make it extremely complex. And we have to try to stay at a high level to keep it somewhat black and white and apples to apples. In the short term, those decisions would have to come before resort tax and this board, the Big Sky County Water and Sewer District Board. In the long term, those kind of questions would come before the canyon area board. But yeah, I get it. You know, you're not going to want to sign a $10,000 check if you just put in a brand new septic system. But when we, you know, our scope was to look at the feasibility or infeasibility of sewering the canyon. And when you look at it from just a pure capital standpoint and the number of connections that would ultimately be down there when it's fully developed, it is in the realm of affordability. The trick is how to make it affordable in the early years when you don't have the people behind that 305,000 gallons per day to fund it all. So that's why you have to look at the phasing scenarios.
No, I appreciate the complication, how complicated it is, but if people that have already invested felt that they were getting some return on that investment, you might get their vote a little quicker too.
Absolutely. Mike Richter's asking, in terms of nutrient loading to the Gallatin River, what are the impacts with the different scenarios? So under the two scenarios where you pump it up here or you keep it in the canyon and build your own plant, the impacts are identical essentially. The two plants, you know, what we landed on for the canyon area standalone would be a membrane bioreactor with nutrient removal capability, same as what we would do up here, because, you know, one of the overarching goals of doing this is to reduce the amount of nitrogen going into the groundwater down in the canyon area and potentially ultimately ending up in the Gallatin River. So no difference between those two. In terms of scenarios and phasing, yes, there is a difference. And the goal is to get as much of that nitrogen load off the books as possible and get it on a plant and you know, reduce by a factor of 10 the amount of nitrogen going into the groundwater down there on a, you know, per resident or per hotel basis. So the faster we can sewer the canyon, the faster we reduce the loading to the groundwater aquifer down there.
Scott, I'll add to that. I think Mike might even be pointing to the extra disposal, kind of the co-solution scenario of extra disposal in the canyon, to where I'd characterize it as always a net reduction. Under the co-solution, there might not be as significant of a net reduction, but a substantial net reduction. And the real benefit is long-term. Without a central collection, loads start to triple pretty darn quick. So always a net reduction, and generally between the two scenarios, they're in the same ballpark.
Question from Scott. Scott, the quarry development would be the obvious benefactor of a canyon sewer system, as they would be adjacent to and accessible to the gravity sewer line with no previous investments. In the case of Ramshorn, there are currently residents that have made investments in either the shared Ramshorn treatment system or on individual septic systems. Would there be any financial considerations for those who have previously made investments are now being asked to pay impact fees, which are the same as new construction? So that's exactly what Mike Schultz was getting at, is any credits for having recently done infrastructure. And, you know, personally, I can't control that. I get the intent behind it. But it would take negotiations with this board if you're connecting to the Big Sky Water Resource Recovery Facility, and I assume the Resort Tax Board would be involved in those discussions. And then at some point, if you weren't in on the ground floor with district formation, you would be taking those negotiations to the Canyon Area Board.
Do you want to comment on the disposal areas that would be available if we were to do something like this? Because that certainly has value to the district. What I'm getting at is there's potential groundwater disposal areas, like Ramshorn, for example, has 3 big drain fields permitted, part of their system. And what we're looking at doing is with treated water that's treated to a much higher standard, what kind of capacity do those drain field areas have if we were to use them instead of rainstorm coming off the back end of their treatment system? And we've done some initial engineering on that, and the quarry development group has given us all their geotechnical data, been very helpful in that regard. And the numbers look encouraging in terms of what we might be able to dispose of in the canyon area. Because we're, as the manager of the district, to do one-to-one doesn't make a lot of sense for us. If we can pick up a lot of wastewater flow from the canyon, turn around and dispose of treated water that handles all of their contribution plus what's coming from our current district, that helps us, and that's a big piece of this. So certainly those drain field areas have value and would be something that developments could bring to the table in terms of negotiating these things going forward.
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question real black and white, but it's not my money to give back. It's the board's, and that it's a valid question, but not one that I can answer. Jim Musket, along the lines of what Mike just said as I was typing, has there been any discussion in the initial engineering feasibility study to possibly accommodate entities such as Ramshorn and Bucks as examples of treatment systems in place to allow their treatment systems to remain in place and come into the system as a gray water connection, possibly a rate that reflects the lesser impact on the new system to help entice them in, or is that not feasible in the design? I assume by gray water, you mean we would intercept
Ramshorn is gray water. They got septic tanks going to these drain field areas, I believe. I don't think there's a gray water scenario for that, but
yeah, I mean,
there are differences.
Right. When you say gray water to me, it's great to get all of this wastewater captured and properly treated, but gray water usually has a lot less nutrients in it, what we call black water. So that's usually what we're after to get into the plant. And these plants also need that higher strength wastewater to grow the bacteria that are going to remove nitrogen and phosphorus for us. So, some people have heard the term step systems, where we take septic tank effluent for the first several years and pump that to a treatment plant. It's very hard to remove nutrients to the degree that we're trying to do up here with septic tank effluent or gray water, which often means dishwater and washing machine water and that waste. What we really need is the human waste element of it to power the whole thing.
Well, Ramshorn could initially come in with their septic tank system where we're getting water off the tanks, and then the district down there would become the entity responsible for getting the tanks pumped. Over time, you would want those to go away, but initially you could leave them in place, just handle the water. You could set up a rate structure based on strength, so you could have a rate conceivably that's a little different for the Ramshorn folks because their strength, their BOD loading would be less because it would be a septic tank effluent disposal situation. So that's possible.
Yep.
And I'd summarize that the analyses completed to date are on the macro scale. I think there's several different micro scale evaluations that what an individual subdivision might bring to the district in terms of assets that might reduce those impact fees, and it's all at a level of detail that is beyond what Scott and I can negotiate, but it's definitely worth evaluating if this project moves forward. So
we're getting into another resort tax cycle, and I've talked to Kristen a little bit. Kristen Gardner's on the conference here. You all are looking at doing a second phase of this study and kind of talking about kind of what's next. Maybe you want to comment on that, either you or Mace or Kristen, on what we're thinking as far as the next steps for the Canyon study.
Yeah. So if the resort tax passes, then there's $12 million of infrastructure there for essentially a grant. That would certainly need a preliminary engineering report to move the ball down the field on that. But you can't move the ball down the field on the lift station and pipeline to get it up here unless you're also looking at the collection system behind it. So that would be a very specific scope that hopefully ultimately would be driven by people going and signing a petition to start a district down there and beat the sunset on the resort tax's offer for that $12 million. So that's the path if the resort tax passes. If the resort tax fails, then it's up to folks like Kristen with the Gallatin River Task Force and the funding supporter being the resort tax to decide if they're going to continue to push and encourage this project and take it to a preliminary design level with resort tax funding. And the next step, the next logical sequence on any of this is what we call preliminary engineering. What we've done so far is typically referred to as conceptual engineering. These are all good questions. If anybody has another, we'll give it a couple minutes here and then let everybody go back to their evening.
Scott, this is Mike Scholes again. I just want to thank you all for what you have done. And yes, there are a lot of good questions and such, but as far as the vote comes, there'll be time to answer all of those questions and come up with the best solutions. I think that everyone just has to understand that this is a great opportunity to leverage a lot of funds for the community. Whether the canyon uses them or not will still largely depend on this vote, or whether they can ever get those funds again, because they're a minority of the district and such. I think that you've done a good job, and living in the canyon for a number of years and such, I think we all owe it to our community and the river quality of life that we have to at least vote for this and give it an opportunity to move forward and fully know that the solution isn't fixed and everyone can work on it together. So thank you for what you've done.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to reiterate that without that resort tax, that 1% vote, I do feel that this canyon solution does potentially stall. And if it stalls now, my optimism decreases that a central wastewater collection system ever gets installed. As development progresses down the canyon, the logistics of forming a district become more challenging. The sunk costs of developer costs in the ground versus comprehensive infrastructure starts to make it a lot heavier lift. So I kind of view it as the time is now if it's going to happen.
Yeah. One question from a Scott. Irrigation benefits from nutrients that your treatment systems are currently planned to remove, primarily nitrogen. That is true. Just for example, the plant up here at Big Sky is cranking out enough nutrients to grow grass without supplemental fertilizer. When we're done with the phase 1 expansion and upgrade, it will not. But the overarching goal with all of these projects is to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus making it into our watershed. What the question is referring to are what we sometimes call menu style or boutique water systems, like you'll see in Southern California, where you'll have 100 MGD plant, with 1 million people behind it, that might pull water out of those plants at different spots in the process, tailored for its end use. And maybe you would leave nutrients in there for a golf course. At this scale, that does not pencil out. And in an MBR facility, there is no sort of two-step sequence where you could take out BOD and TSS and reuse that wastewater with the nutrients in it. You just got to go full bore. So that ability to kind of dial in the exact water quality you want costs a lot of money. The questioner goes on to say, discharge to the Gallatin has not been proposed, but all the treatment options seem to lead in that direction. I'm not quite sure what that means.
I think it's getting to the point that we're trying to take nitrogen down to sub 5 and kind of picking that as our bar for treatment. That sub 5 isn't picked for direct discharge to the river. It's recognizing net nutrient reduction to the aquifer is how I look at it, with septic systems going in the ground in the 20 to 40 milligrams per liter total nitrogen. MBR takes it down to sub 5, so maintaining a net reduction with MBR is a lot more achievable. On the flip side, lower quality treatment may cost less, but to do land application, that becomes space intensive. There's we kind of selected the bar of high quality effluent as we're going to design to and cost around. So
yeah, the goal with the sub 5 is to get to the class A-1 reuse quality water that's regulated by DEQ, so that we have the ability to reuse this water for just about anything you could reuse water for down there. So it's the ability to irrigate at the high school or put it in a rapid infiltration basin that in that close proximity to the Gallatin River, with confidence that you're not contributing a large nitrogen load to the river. So that's what drives the nitrogen removal. And snowmaking down there is, that's not out of the question either, if somebody wanted to put in a cross-country loop or something. So if there's anything we've learned up at Big Sky, it's to maximize your reuse portfolio and your ability to dispose of water. That's the real key up here. If you're going to stay out of the river, you got to develop lots of other ways to dispose and reuse wastewater. Well, thank you all for attending. We appreciate it. We have another month here before the vote, just to beat a dead horse. If you vote yes, you're not committing to anything. You're just putting your thumb down on that $12 million that the resort tax is committed to hold it in place. You can evaluate what you want to do for a couple of years before it becomes absolutely critical. So just be aware of that when you vote. And if you do vote, be aware of the timeline. I think April
28th, to return mail your ballot. May 5th, if you can drop your ballots off up to May 5th. We have a couple more meetings planned, one on April 16th and one on April 30th, where we'll be online again. Probably similar presentations. You'll have the ability to ask more questions. If you have questions, certainly email us. On our website, we've got an FAQ page where we're trying to answer questions as they come into us. I know Kristen on the task force, David Tucker's been doing some work building pages that are dedicated to this project. All the videos we're recording and we're posting those to my site, Kristen's site at the task force, and I think Resort Tax may be picking some of this stuff up as well. So there's a couple mailings that are going to be going out. The Resort Tax District will be doing a mailing to their registered voter list, and that'll probably be coming up soon. The Water and Sewer District, we're in the process of putting together a first quarter billing, which we're pushing off for a week. We'll start sending those out April 6th. In that billing, we'll have an informational insert talking about the 1%, the project, with some links to some of the videos and whatnot that we've already talked about and recorded, which are specific to the project and the engineering for the treatment plant upgrade. We've crossed over the 50% design point on our plant. We're starting to get nice renderings of what the new treatment plant project looks like. We're on a timeline to get that under bidding this fall so we can be in construction next year. Difficult times for sure to be putting big bond and big expense issues out there, but my board, we've been committed to keeping the train on the tracks, moving forward, working on this expansion. We don't think we get to take a year off and rest in what's going on, so we're moving ahead.
Ron, correct me if I'm wrong. Did you just say that you could drop off your ballot?
Yeah, so if you're gonna mail it, there's no drop-offs anywhere in Big Sky. So they have to get mailed to the election office. And there's no drop-offs here because of we're all closed to the public. But you can drop your ballot off at the courthouse. The election department will be taking them up till May 5. So if you miss the April 8th, 28th to mail it, you can take it to the courthouse and drop it off. You know, we're telling people though, just mail it.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Don't put yourself in the situation where you need to go to the courthouse.
Yeah. Is there any scenario potentially where Gallatin County closes that drop off? And
We've been told not.
Okay.
So I think they'll live with that because that's what they're telling us. So
okay.
They'll have something set up for that, but since this is all mail ballot, there's really no reason not to just mail it on or before April 28th.
All right. Thank you for your time and interest, and go have a good night.